the Property Pod. Welcome to the Property Pod with Moneyweb. The property sector is an ever-changing sector. And in this podcast series, your host, Suren Naidu, chats to movers and shakers in the property industry.
Hello and welcome to the Property Pod, South Africa's premier property investor podcast. My name is Suren Naidu, and on this weekly Moneyweb show, we gain insider insights from leading executives, analysts, developers and entrepreneurs in the country's expansive property industry. David Green joined the V&A Waterfront in 2009 as CEO. That was during the Dubai World Days, which bought the iconic property or precinct as part of a joint venture with London and Regional Properties around 2006, I believe, from original developers Transnet. It was ahead of the World Cup in South Africa when South Africa was in the spotlight. But following the global financial crisis in 2008, by 2012, the V&A Waterfront was back in South African hands when JSE-listed Growthpoint Properties and the PIC bought the trophy property asset. As a 50-50 joint owners of the V&A, they have invested probably over 10 billion rand in developments over the last 13 years, and the property is valued well over 20 billion rand today. But there are big projects on the go, including the much grander Grand Bay expansion, which is being finalized. David Green, who was on the Property Pod back in September 2021 after the COVID-19 lockdowns and fallout, first gave us a teaser of what was to come, saying at the time that it will be a jewel in the crown, future development phase in the V&A. Now, after pushing, we have David back on the Property Pod to give us the latest developments at Cape Town's and South Africa's most iconic tourist destination, and probably the trophy property asset in South Africa that everybody would love to own, but it's with Growthpoint and the PIC. Welcome back to the Property Pod, David.
Thanks, Serene. Nice to be here.
It's almost been 4 years since I chatted to you. Before we get to the development update, this year you received a couple of accolades, the first being the Officer of the Order of the British Empire, which is more popularly known as the OBE, by King Charles, the current King Charles, for your outstanding contribution to UK-South African relations. And that was in January. But earlier this month, at the Future Hospitality Summit in Cape Town, you were recognized for your outstanding contribution to the hospitality industry. How do you feel about these awards?
Serene, it's very gratifying to receive that recognition and to receive the awards. But I'm very conscious the awards are received in relation to the V&A Waterfront, and what the V&A Waterfront's achieved. And there's a great number of people working in the team here at the Waterfront, the shareholders and the tenants who are collectively making the achievements happen. So I'm very humbled, but I'm very conscious that it's the activities and the innovation and creativity of a lot of people who go in to make the progress that we've achieved at the Waterfront.
Thanks, very humble there, but you are the CEO, so it's a case of lead from the front, and we know what the V&A has achieved in recent years, especially post-COVID. Record December, from what I understand. I know you mentioned this to me when I did a walkabout, in fact, in December before the peak rush. But for our listeners, tell us how you became involved as CEO in the V&A Waterfront. It must be quite a pretty exciting job.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly exciting job, and I've now been in the job 17 years, and every day is different, and the opportunities are probably stronger now than they've ever been. But I guess my first exposure to South Africa was in about 96. I had one of these kind of international world jobs. I'd probably worked in something like 50 countries, and like many people, I came to Cape Town, South Africa, and thought, wow, this is a pretty impressive place. We bought a house in 99, and we used to visit quite frequently. And then in 2008, my wife and I, our children having graduated, we decided to come to South Africa and see for an extended period of time. And it just happened, good fortune, that the V&A had changed hands. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine I'd be running the V&A. I obviously visited, was very impressed by what they'd done. But yeah, following the sale, as you correctly said, by Transnet into London Regional and Dubai, they were looking for a CEO. I'd spent the last 10 years working in the port and property sector, where in the UK, the ports were privatized with their land. So I, rapidly realized the sort of potential of this opportunity, and I was fortunate enough to be employed, as you say, in February 2009 to take on the role.
Okay. The V&A is jointly owned, as I mentioned, by Growthpoint and the PIC, and that's the Public Investment Corporation, obviously on behalf of GEPF as well, shareholders. And there's a lot on the go at the moment with expansions, both at the shopping centre side, expansions, new hotels coming in, including the Table Bay Hotel. Several construction cranes are in the sky, and that's always a positive sign. These are current projects. Can you give us some highlights on these current projects, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think just before I do, if I might just dwell on that, the current ownership, because I do think that it is following that change in ownership to, what is effectively a public-private partnership. So you have public-private partnership, long-term investors. They have similar but differing investment aims. They're both looking for an investment yield. They're looking for long-term growth. But I do think a large part of the success has been this public-private partnership model. I think for both the PIC and Growthpoint, arguably it is their most successful investment in property. I think both will say that, certainly their trophy investment. And it's an interesting model because the land ownership is retained. So the 123 hectares is retained. And at the waterfront, we master plan, strategize, we do the development, and the development is for retention, which I think has multiple advantages in that you're developing with a view to retain. So you're looking at it from a more long-term perspective. You can do more innovative things in terms of sustainability, for instance, because you've got a longer-term payback on it. But it is, I think there are many challenging things within the South African environment, but this as an example of a public-private partnership and the potential to roll this out in different parts of the country, I think is quite high, and I think it's a model that should be looked at, as opposed to the alternative models, which are very much kind of almost transactional based, development based. But yeah, turning to the development, we've probably got close on to 5 billion in the ground currently in terms of our projects. So maybe if you'd like, I'll run through a few of them.
Sure.
The Victoria Wharf Shopping Centre. Now, the Victoria Wharf Shopping Centre started as a 25,000 square metre shopping centre, which is relatively modest. We're now touching we're in excess of 100,000 square metres of retail within the waterfront throughout the precinct. And this is now the fifth phase of expansion within the main shopping centre, the Victoria Wharf, and it's a real salutary lesson that you build these centres with a view that you might, if they're successful, plan them so that you can expand them, and that's what we're doing. So we're adding about 5,000 square metres of luxury. There's very strong demand within Southern Africa for luxury, whether that's from tourists or whether that's within the continent, and we see ourselves as being the premier area, certainly within the Western Cape, arguably within South Africa, for these luxury tenants.
Okay. I didn't realize it's 100,000 square meters of retail, so it's probably the size of a regional mall. We know it's
we're clearly in the regional mall size. The Victoria Wharf itself, I think, is just coming on to 80,000, but throughout the precinct. And I think we very much view our retail as exploiting is probably the wrong word, but actually leveraging all the different areas within the waterfront of retail.
Thanks for that, David. On the new projects, you talked about the 5,000 square meters, but the cranes in the sky at the moment is a new hotel. And then you have about R1 billion going into an overhaul of the Table Bay, which is significant because you could build 2 hotels with that money.
Yeah, absolutely. At this point in time, we see the sort of market gap and demand in major international brands and us playing the role at the premium end. So both these hotels we're looking at the premium end. The Table Bay is going to be an intercontinental, 320 rooms, luxury rooms. The nice thing about the Table Bay is that it's got very good bones. So there's large rooms that we can convert and refurbish. So very excited about that one. That one fully will come on stream in 1 December. But as I say, I think our strategic direction is to say that South Africa isn't sufficiently well represented in the major international brands, and particularly at the premium end. So the second hotel, which unfortunately I can't give you the name of, but it is very well-known international brand, and it's probably their top, what you might call contemporary luxury premium brand that they are rolling out. So yeah, this one is a sort of probably 6-star, 142 key. Every one of the rooms will have its own private balcony. We are also going to dip our toe into the branded residence. There's going to be 6 branded residences. This is quite a big theme. Cape Town as a city punches above its weight in terms of the major international cities, and there's quite a bit of demand for people to have a place, a luxury apartment that can be kind of serviced and looked after for them. But yeah, between these two is 2 billion alone that we're investing.
Thanks for that, David. Just on the Table Bay, I know there's been a lot of coverage on it, but it is owned by the V&A Waterfront. I see a familiar influence saying that it's now owned by the waterfront, and I just wanted clarity on that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The waterfront does own pretty much all of the property and buildings within the waterfront area. We will lease, and the historic model within the hotel sector was that we would lease the hotel on a long-term lease, possibly with some sort of profit participation. But I think as we develop the waterfront, what we are seeing is that at least a good part of the success of the hotels within the precinct, within the waterfront neighbourhood, is dependent on how well we run the neighbourhood. So what we're looking at doing in the waterfront is kind of going more upstream, if you like, and we're saying, well, we'll take franchises, we'll take management agreements, but we'll basically take a greater share than a pure lease operation, which is probably within the property sector, conventional leases would be the norm. But the international hotels work on this model, this sort of management agreement or franchise agreement model. And if you're going to play in that space, you have to be taking on some of the operational risks. We've now got 15 hotels, getting close to 2,000 rooms within the waterfront. So we've got a dedicated team who look after and manage and are familiar with hotel operations as opposed to pure property leasing.
I'm sorry to stick on hotels, but you've answered about the Quay 7 development, and it's pretty exciting. We'll look forward to that official announcement on the brand that's coming in. But I do know at the Cape Grace, there was quite a significant investment from the new owners, and there is another construction on a residential apartment called 5 Dock Road. Is that complete? Because I gather it's part of that 5 billion under construction at the moment.
Yeah, that's correct. So that's about a 400 to 500 million. We call it 5 Dock Road. It's just under 100 luxury apartments. Now these apartments we are selling, and we're over 90% sold. So we're over about 83 of the 98 units are sold. So yeah, we're looking at building residential to let. So we introduced that in the waterfront probably 5 or 6 years ago, whereby we would build specifically to rent. And there's certain economies that you can get in building these units specifically to rent. You set them up cabled for Wi-Fi. They have centralized water heating systems. And what we've found is that you can get a pretty acceptable yield, and then over time you retain the capital appreciation. So our predominant model going forward on hospitality is going to be in the build to rent, but occasionally we'll look at sites and decide that they're better for sale, and that's 5 Dock Road. So 5 Dock Road is, as I say, over 90% sold out, and we're in the process of identifying other sites that we might bring forward for residential for sale.
And a little bit of insight on that Cape Grace, because it's now a Fairbairn branded hotel under French group Accor.
Under Accor.
Yes.
Yeah, I know, we're very excited about that one. That one is we own the land, and the property is in a long-term lease from us to the developer, which is Casada. And Casada have been working in partnership with Accor. And yeah, that's a beautiful refurbishment that they've done. They've really, I think, taken what was a grand old lady in the Cape Grace, and they've taken it forward into one of their top brands, the Fairmont Hotel. So it's actually a great offering. We're very, very pleased with that Casada investment.
David, I have to ask, it was mentioned a little bit in Growth Point's results presentation, not this year, but last year. Cranes and expansion are a good side. You talk about 5 billion rand worth of current projects, including the expansion of the Victoria Wharf Shopping Centre for that luxury wing. But surely it will affect trading in the mall where work is underway. The Table Bay is also out until the end of the year. So yes, it's a R1 billion development, but you're also going to lose room bookings. Obviously, it's not in the peak summer season. Do you want to comment a little bit on that? Will it have an impact on the financial side for at least this financial year?
Yes. So the Table Bay is our largest single most profitable hotel. So yes, that will have an impact because we've taken those 320 rooms out. We closed down just the end of February after Mining and Daba. We're doing a pretty fast turnaround to refurbish every one of the rooms and reopen all the public areas, and some 200 rooms come December. But as a broader question, so that will impact on the financials, definitely. Broader question, I think we're always trying to do this balancing act. I'm a great believer that you've got to continually refurbish. People want their old favourites, but they also want fresh, new and different. So since I've been here, we've pretty much looked to bring on new, fresh and different each year. But it is a balancing act between the construction work that you have ongoing in the site and not making that detrimental to the attractiveness of the site. So we look at that very carefully. As you say, we try to do a lot of work in the winter period. And we also try to phase the work, and we try to focus it in particular areas so that we're not having interventions throughout the entire site. But it's quite a balancing act. I think if you look around the world at kind of similar waterfronts, some of them have failed to reinvest and have become old and tired, and rapidly there's always somebody looking to come along and take over your sort of leadership role. So we think it is a kind of continuum that will constantly, but we try to manage it in a way that doesn't inconvenience customers or inconvenience them as little as possible.
Well, I suppose it's a case of short-term pain for long-term gain. And now on the big news, the future expansion around Granger Bay, 10 to 15-year development over several phases. From a Growth Point presentation, I understand it could cost anything as a base case between 20 and 24 billion. Where are those plans sitting at the moment? When can we expect to see approvals for the bulk from City of Cape Town and other authorities?
Yeah, what we're doing here is that we're applying for planning consent to give us a sort of 10 to 15-year runway on development. When I joined the waterfront, there was, out of the 600,000 allocated square metres of bulk, there was about 200,000 left. Pretty much all of those now we've allocated by largely creating the silo district, the canal district, connecting the waterfront to the city. That was seen as the priority. So that we had this extraordinary neighbourhood that was within walking distance and safe walking distance of the centre of the city. So that was the rationale behind the silo and the canal district. The jewel in the crown, I think, as you mentioned in your introduction, has always been the Granger Bay area. The area in front of the shopping centre, which now it's a bay, but it's kind of inaccessible because of the coastal protection, and then of course round towards in front of the stadium where currently Grand Beach and the Oz Market are. So that's the extent of the area. That's the Granger Bay area, and most of the development will go in to that area. So what we have is we have a planning consent for some 440,000 square metres of bulk. with the city. We're hoping that it will go through the Municipal Planning Tribunal sometime this year, within this calendar year, and that will allow us to have that sort of 10 to 15-year runway. I mean, these kind of longer-term development plans will always, they change almost before the ink is dry. But at this point in time, we're looking at the focus being on hospitality and residential. Very excited about the tourism potential within Cape Town, Western Cape and South Africa. We see medium term, doubling the number of international tourists and local tourists within that time horizon as being a realistic proposition. So probably something like 5 hotels within that development, backed up by quite a lot of residential and supportive retail. I don't see, where we are in terms of online bricks and mortar retail. I think you've got to be quite cautious about how much retail you put down, but certainly supporting retail in terms of restaurants and stores, and even commercial office demand. We've very much established the waterfront as the premier city centre destination for office accommodation. And we have zero availability, so we see the prospect of in certain selected areas, additional commercial office development.
Thanks for that insight. Is it too early to ask when can we see first cranes going up? Is it, there is land there where you can develop before you actually go into the actual Grandeur Bay area, because I know it could be around the heliport side and that sort of thing. Just a little bit of insight, because there's been a lot of reports. We've also covered it, but there's a tremendous amount of excitement around that, and one would hope the city does approve the bulk.
Yeah, I think we're hoping we'll get the bulk approved, and we're hoping that we can have almost like a continuum of developments. So we are in front of the Table Bay. We're in the ground on another build to rent residential, as I've talked about. We're looking at extending into retirement living. We think there's quite a strong demand within the sector, and the sort of benefit we can offer in terms of amenities, safety, security, walkability, medical facilities. So we've got pipeline, which will take us forward possibly 2-3 years. And thereafter, we would start to use this new bulk that we're applying for.
Is most of it on the land side? Because again, I just needed some clarity with some influencer comments that there's a massive reclamation. But from the plans I've seen, it doesn't seem that's the case.
Yeah, we're at the tip of Africa. We need coastal protection. At times you'll have sort of 7-meter waves. So we certainly need to continue to invest in our coastal protection. And the scheme that we have currently is a very innovative scheme, which allows the coastal protection when it's needed, which is about 5 to 10% of the year. And the rest of the time, it's a publicly accessible, amenity, walkable, rock pools, swimming pools. That is the plan that we put forward. That does have an element of, quite a smallish element of land reclamation as part of these coastal protection plans. And that, under national legislation, needs to go through the Integrated Coastal Management Act, and we're exploring how to manage through that. We think it's the optimal scheme for the location. And that's the one pursuit. But it's a land reclamation. The bulk of it is in relation to the coastal protection. As you say, most of the development is land side going forward.
Thanks for your frankness on that. I appreciate it. I'm sure it's not easy to comment on plans that are still awaiting approvals and need to be financed. David, you talked about doubling the visitor numbers. That was going to be my last question, but I'm going to ask it ahead of my last question. What is the visitor numbers? I know I read somewhere 3 million visitors in December alone last year, which was a record. So where does it sit, and what are your targets, balancing between development and making sure it's still the most visited destination in South Africa?
Yeah, so we receive 25 million visits. Now, that could be the same people multiple times. And in fact, on international tourists, they will visit the waterfront on multiple occasions. But we're looking that the waterfront will be capable of handling over 36 million visits in a calendar year. So it's about planning and designing the waterfront neighbourhood and precinct to have more walkability, more public spaces, areas that people can explore. And we've very much been working on kind of broadening the heart of that to cope with those visit numbers. When I talked about the doubling, I was talking about international tourists who are arrivals basically at Cape Town International Airport, which is a surprisingly low figure of 1.5 million. In addition to that, we're probably talking about 250,000 through the cruise terminal. But, people, one point I always like to make is that, cities like Venice and Barcelona, who are concerned about over-tourism, they're receiving 40, 50 million international tourists. We are a relatively modest 1.5 million, and therefore the ability of the infrastructure to cope with doubling of that at all levels of infrastructure is actually there, and that would be a great generator of jobs within the economy.
Thanks for that. Last question, David. Winter is low season for Cape Town, Cape of Storms. We know the weather there. But what are your expectations for 2025 peak summer season? You say the Table Bay will largely be open by the 1st, but you have a lot of other hotels there. I'm just asking in terms of forward bookings. Is it too early to ask that question?
So we're seeing somewhere between high single digit tourism. So we've fully, Cape Town has fully recovered from COVID. So Cape Town's probably looking at 15% above pre-COVID levels, which is not the situation nationally, sadly. So we're looking at something, what we're tracking is around the kind of 7 to 8% growth in international visits. Winter is good for the Middle East market, and there's a very high correlation between international visitors and airlift. And of course, with the kind of Middle Eastern, Qatar, Emirates flights into Cape Town are bringing a lot of Middle East people who enjoy the Cape Town winter. US is also a very, very strong market for us and growing market. And, I think there's a lot of division in the world, a lot of anxiety and conflict, but we are a very friendly destination and also, kind of away from the stresses within Europe and North America. So far that tourism is holding up because of the attractiveness of the destination. And we've got some things to do to grow potential markets like India and China, and the changes in visa are already starting to bear fruit. But our big markets, which is Europe and North America, plenty of potential for them to grow at good levels.
David, we'll have to leave it there. We probably can allow an hour-long interview, but thank you so much for your time. We know you're a busy man. That was David Green, the CEO of the V&A Waterfront in Cape Town.
Thanks for listening to the Moneyweb Property Pod with Suren Naidu. To listen to more episodes, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates. Follow Suren on Twitter @Suren Naidu for more of his property industry content and other business stories.